Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Jiafwich. Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you, dear guests, representatives, and respected viewers. My name is Mustafa Tariq. I am the chairman of Afghan Council of Ireland, as well as I work as a public relations consultant. Today is the first session of this webinar series where we will be having an overview of the application process of Family Reunification, IHAP, and there will also be some information given out on the refugee protection program. Our agenda for today will be a brief introduction, and then our special guest Catherine will be giving out the information. And the last point of the agenda will be where if you have any questions that Catherine did not mention, you can ask at the end. Thank you very much for joining us, and good afternoon, Catherine. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Mustafa. Thanks for inviting me to come along today. You can take it that this is just maybe a first. You mentioned it's a series of seminars that you'll hold, but I'm very conscious of the fact that, like, in the time available to us, like, we can't possibly cover everything. It's a complicated area. So the purpose of today really is to give an overview of the main ways in which Afghan family members can try to come to Ireland at the moment, with the caveat that there is a huge gap between the theory and the possibility of applying and the actual practice of applying, and there being a realistic prospect at the current time for positive decisions. Okay. I'm also conscious of the fact that there's a lot of information circulating in the public domain about visas here and visas there, but there's a lack of clarity to whom they may actually apply. And so the purpose of this short presentation today is to give an overview of the different options that might be available, and then the caveat around the difficulties of the actual practice and procedure of applying for these, and particularly given that some of the schemes are not yet open. So I want to reserve some time at the end for questions, and perhaps what I'll do is fly through the presentation. In particular, I'm going to be very superficial about some of them, in particular EU treaty rights applications for family members who may have, for Afghans who may have EU citizenship status as opposed to Irish citizenship, but we get one or two calls on our helpline about that. So I'll just go through very quickly all of the different options and then leave some time for Q&A at the end. By way of very brief introduction, because I'm conscious that many people may not know who I am or who the organisation is. My name is Catherine. I am the managing solicitor of the Immigrant Council of Ireland's Law Centre, and the Immigrant Council of Ireland itself is a national charitable organisation based here in Dublin, and we provide frontline services by way of a helpline, and then dealing directly with the smaller number of cases where it's possible for us to do that, having regard to our own level of staffing and whatnot. We have a law centre where we employ 2 solicitors, I'm one of them, and some other legal support staff to assist with some applications, but it's not possible for us to take on every case. And specifically with regard to responding to the current situation for Afghans, it's clearly not possible for us with only 2 solicitors to deal with every case. We have a pro bono referral scheme with 3 law firms that we work quite closely with in a different context, who volunteered to accept some referrals in these situations, but it's not an open for all scenario. They have indicated that they will have maximum capacity, for example, to deal with 25 applications, and only really where people meet criteria. So it's quite a difficult situation where I appreciate many people are hopeful that they will be able to deal with applications. But anyway, we'll come back to that in just a moment. So to fly through, you'll have the slides, so I won't bore you with the details about our contact details. They're there for people if they need them at the end. For the purpose of this presentation as well, I've set out in the slides what I've set out here on this blue slide, some general information about visa application procedures, regardless of whether or not you're applying under one or other of the specific schemes, just to clarify for people what the general visa application procedure is. And then I'm going to look at the different things, the IRPP, the statutory family reunification, what that actually means, discretionary visa applications then, and then humanitarian assistance program. I've actually changed the order since I first did this slide, so there's a slight discrepancy there. But some of them I'll just be touching on. So for the general visa applications, just to clarify for people, there is a very specific online visa application procedure that must be followed. What we have experienced in response to certain events recently is that people tend to just email, whether it's our service or a government department, and they just send out a whole load of information, often attaching quite sensitive, detailed information about individuals. And I would caution against people doing that. I appreciate that they may just be very keen to try and trigger attention, but certainly it's not necessary if you're just emailing someone at the first. Until you're requested to provide certain documents, don't provide those documents. I'm very risk averse as a lawyer, but I just have concerns about the potential for documents ending up in people's inboxes that are quite sensitive, copies of government IDs, for example, or tezkeras or whatever, and that there is a possibility on occasion that these documents can be duplicated by people that you wouldn't want them to be duplicated by. So I always say, don't provide documents to people unless you're specifically requested to do that, to guard against data protection issues or possibly identity theft and what have you. So there is a very specific visa application process for anybody who wants to come to Ireland. And it's the same visa application process, regardless of where you may fit within the overall immigration system. So the Department of Justice operates this, what I call AVATs here. And when a person clicks into that, you commence a visa application and you basically set out there who it is that you're applying for, what the relationship is to a person in Ireland. And it goes from page to page, and you can go back into the application until it is completed. Once it is completed online, you are required to actually generate a hard copy of the application, which is then signed by the visa applicant in principle. In many instances, it's the family member who's here in Ireland who's signing the visa application form. And then it is submitted in hard copy to the Irish Embassy. For Afghans, that's usually the embassy in the United Arab Emirates. And it is sent with a lot of hard copy documents to do it. The first starting point for a visa application, generally, I'm going to just skip over that because it's general visa information. Most people are going to be applying for what are called D-class visas, okay? C-class are only used in very, very specific contexts, and I'll touch on that again. But most of the time, if you're hoping to bring a family member to Ireland for an indefinite period of time to live here, and they'll be staying more than 90 days, then you apply for a D-class visa. That's part of the AVAT system, where there's a drop-down menu where you click on which specific category of visa that you're applying for. And once you've indicated D-class, there's a further drop-down menu where you indicate specifically, is it a joint family member of an Irish citizen, or is it a joint family member of a non-Irish citizen family member, and what? So you have to be very explicit about who exactly is applying and like what the specific class of visa is. As I say, they are submitted to the embassy, and in principle should be submitted with things like the passport of the visa applicant, as well as other information that is generally required regarding the sponsor. That's the terminology that is used to describe the person living in Ireland. The reality is that there are very many practical difficulties at the moment submitting visa applications for Afghan family members. And I might come to that in the Q&A if I haven't touched on it, but we get asked a whole load of information about, will they accept scanned copies of them at the moment? We can't send them. We can't actually answer what the embassy will deal with in individual cases. But normally a visa application is predicated on the applicant, and that's the family member outside of the state, being able to show that they have a passport that is in date and valid. First of all, it is to satisfy the embassy regarding their identity, because clearly there's a state interest in knowing who they may be admitting to the country, but also it's a practical issue. You cannot have a visa issued to you if there is no document that the visa can actually be endorsed into. The visa is merely a sticker, and that sticker indicates to airlines, for example, that this person is pre-authorized for travel. So it's not just a question of an embassy being difficult and going, oh, you don't have a passport, we can't give you. They can't physically issue you a visa if you don't hold a passport. But the whole point of the visa is to facilitate your international travel and to indicate to authorities in third countries or elsewhere that you are actually entitled to travel and will be accepted for entry into Ireland. So there's a huge practical challenge around this, where family members may want to apply for visas, but actually don't hold passports at the moment. So we can come back to that if there are questions about it. Some of our callers, for example, did have passports here in Ireland already, and that has obviously facilitated applications to be made because they had intended to apply well prior to the current crisis, for example, but were unable to do so earlier in the year due to pandemic restrictions on visas, but they did have the documents ready. So in other instances, they've had the documents available, but now they can't send them because there are difficulties sending these documents internationally at the moment because of the lack of an effective functioning postal service. That may change, but certainly, again, being very risk averse, I would say to people, hold off sending your documents to the embassy because you do not want to risk that these documents go missing in the post. We have clients at the moment who, for example, had already been approved for visas here in Ireland. They had the visas in the passports and they sent them prior to the middle of August, and they're now stuck missing in the Kabul postal sorting department. So you don't want that to happen either. And obviously I can't advise somebody to take extraordinary measures, for example, to engage in using fixers in order to get documents in and out of the country. Some people do that, and I entirely understand why they do it, but obviously I can't advise it myself as a lawyer because I can't accept responsibility for people doing it and then the documents going missing, for example. So people will do what they feel they may need to do. But it is to just make it clear, the visa application at the outset is really facilitated where a family member who wishes to apply actually has a passport for family members. If they don't have them, of course, all that can happen is that you can complete a visa application form and enter into the section of the visa application form XXX when it comes to the passport details, or you can generate quote false information. So you can put in, for example, the drop-down menu when it comes to identifying the passport requirement is you can say national passport or international travel document and put in, you know, dates of issuing and dates of expiry that don't exist, because you need to put in something to be able to go to the next page of the visa application. But it's essential then in a cover letter to communicate that that information there has been purely put in order to generate a visa application form, and that the visa applicant doesn't in fact hold a passport with those dates or an international travel document with those dates, but that they're hopeful that the Irish authorities will accept the application and engage in a process of communication with them about how to proceed in these circumstances. Now, we don't know at this point in time how they will proceed in these specific cases. I have insights from previous experiences where when family members are in principle approved, the Irish authorities may be prepared to issue Irish travel documents to those family members who are approved. But it's usually predicated on the ability of that family member to actually present into an Irish embassy to be assisted with that process. And of course, while that may have happened in the past in some instances, or may still happen if Afghan family members find themselves in a third country where they can get into an embassy, that might still be possible, but it's not necessarily realistic to expect that that's going to be offered for Afghan family members who are currently in Afghanistan and can't actually physically present into an embassy. So there are huge practical difficulties with issuing visas where the relevant documents are not available, or there's no realistic prospect of an Afghan family member getting to an embassy to avail of assistance. The Irish authorities have not had an embassy in Afghanistan in years, and that has got nothing to do with the current situation. So it has always been a challenge when dealing with certain aspects of reunification applications, due to the fact that some things that can happen in some cases have always been difficult to do in Afghanistan. So that's just general information about visa and the category of visa that you'll be applying for. I want to touch on the Irish Refugee Protection Programme, because many people ask us about this. First of all, what is it? The Irish Refugee Protection Programme was introduced by the Irish authorities in the mid-2010s in response to what people referred to as the migration crisis. Increasing numbers of people, particularly arriving at the EU frontier in Greece and Italy, and responding to that as kind of a mutual burden sharing process across the EU. And the government committed to accepting up to 4,000 people into Ireland under that EU relocation programme, as well as its existing UNHCR refugee resettlement programme. As part of the IRPP, or the Irish Refugee Protection Programme, they have also introduced what is called international humanitarian assistance programs. So they're part of the same program. Specifically regarding Afghanistan, the immediate response on the part of the government was to say that we commit to introducing a certain number of visas to Afghans under our international refugee protection program. The difficulty is that it's not generally an open visa application process. It's not possible in most instances to just apply for a visa. So they were known, for example, that they would be issued to people who were already identified by the Irish authorities, specifically the Department of Foreign Affairs, to frontline human rights defenders, for example, or individuals that were known to them to be particularly at risk by virtue of roles that they held, whether that was in government or in other civil society organizations, or because they were very visible scholars working on particular issues. And they committed initially to issuing 195 visa applications. Since then, it's been reported in the media that in fact more than 195 visas have been issued, and it's in the region of 350. Whether more will be issued is unknown, but it's generally not an application process that is open. Some people I am aware of who I've been in direct contact with have managed to contact the embassy and to say, I'm particularly at risk, can I be given access under this program? Those individuals that I'm aware of had managed to leave Afghanistan already prior to the border kind of closing, or the closure of the airport towards the end of August. They had managed to get into a neighboring third country and were able to get assistance to come. And in some cases, in addition to being approved under the IRPP, they were also facilitated with what are called visa waivers, which is effectively just a letter where it's not possible for the embassy to endorse a passport with a visa sticker because they haven't received the document in the embassy to do that. The visa waiver is issued. It's effectively a letter confirming that this person has been approved for entry to Ireland and to facilitate their international travel. But these are cases that are few and far between, and I wouldn't want to give anybody elevated expectation that if they're seeking to bring a family member, even where they can identify that perhaps that family member may be at risk in some way by virtue of their employment status or what have you, that it is easy to secure an IRPP permission to come to Ireland. Of course, I understand if people wish to try that, but I do know through colleagues that where they have made some applications like this, that they have been rejected. I don't know whether or not that's because in terms of risk, they are requiring people to make or to reach a specific threshold, or if the reality is just a practical consideration that if the family member has not yet been able to leave Afghanistan, that there's just actually no practical possibility at the current time of a family member actually making it to Ireland under the IRPP programme. So we can come back to that if people want to ask any further questions. But Mustafa just raised a question with me prior to the seminar on what is the actual status issued to people under the IRPP program. And I don't know if any of the attendees today have been admitted under that program. If you are admitted under that program, then you are coming from the outset as an approved refugee. You're being given program refugee status. So there's no requirement for you to actually apply for international protection on arrival in the way that an Afghan who may arrive at the point of entry and is seeking international protection, having not been given program refugee status prior to entry. So there's no domestic application required. There are some post-arrival requirements to be fulfilled. Most of you who are here as Afghan nationals will be aware of registration requirements imposed on all foreign nationals from third countries. And so program refugees need to comply with that. So post-arrival physically at the airport, there is some additional bureaucracy to take care of in terms of final letters of approval being issued, but it's not a domestic application for international protection. And once the final paperwork is issued, which can take a couple of weeks, then there's a registration procedure to get the actual Irish residence permit. But once it is issued, the person will have what's called a stamp for program refugee IRP card, and they have all of the same rights as a person who is granted refugee status under the Domestic International Protection Office procedures. The rights are set out in section 53 of the International Protection Act. There's no need for me to dwell on that at length, but effectively a refugee or a program refugee or subsidiary protection status holder, the language changes depending on what status is given under domestic procedures, but they have effectively all of the same rights as an Irish citizen in terms of access to the labour market, access to social protections, access to medical cards, and et cetera, et cetera. So the only thing they don't have is actually the formal trappings of Irish citizenship. So they're entitled to enter in and out of the state visa free. They're entitled to be issued with travel documents to facilitate that travel and what have you. So although there may be a number of weeks where people are experiencing short-term delay in terms of finalizing of paperwork, they are in fact granted program refugee status under IRPP entry. And that's a very positive thing, because as well, if anybody here has experience of applying for international protection under the domestic procedure, that can be extremely lengthy and delayed for lots of different reasons, which we needn't dwell on this morning. Related then, as I say, to IRPP, International Humanitarian Assistance Programme is part of the IRPP. So I'm going to move on to that. This was the second kind of announcement. In addition to the kind of 195 visas, which has become more like 350, they have also committed to introducing an International Humanitarian Assistance Programme, or IHAP, specifically for Afghans. That was just committed to recently, but the important thing to underscore just for today is that it's not yet open for applications. The current indications are that it will open in December. It may open sooner, it may open later. So I'm not making any promises today, but the current indications are that it will open in December. My personal speculation, like why wait till December? Well, it's because the Department of Justice is already in the process of trying to finalize other categories of visa applications that are already pending for Afghan family members. So they're trying to clear backlogs before opening a further scheme. That's just speculation on my part. Civil society organisations like ourselves and the Irish Refugee Council, for example, are advocating that it open sooner, but I expect that we may be waiting until December for it to open. What have they indicated? They've indicated that it will be up to possibly 500 family members that will be approved under IHAP. Whether it will be more, nobody knows, okay, but that's the current commitment. Under previous schemes, because that's all we can really go on at the moment about what will this scheme look like. No details have really been released about what the current scheme will look like, other than it'll open in December, it'll be for 500, and that possibly an applicant will be able to apply for 4 different family members. Under previous schemes, what was required? Well, there was quite a lengthy application form called a proposal form that had to be completed. It had to be signed by the applicant, which was the family member here in Ireland, and there was a witness statutory declaration that also had to be signed to swear that all of the details were true and accurate, for example. There were then eligibility criteria. So in order to be able to apply, the applicant had to be able to, sorry, I moved on there by mistake. The actual family member in Ireland had to demonstrate that they either had international protection status, so they were a refugee or held subsidiary protection status, or were an Irish citizen, that they were of good character, and that they met financial and accommodation criteria. They were a little bit fuzzy, and to note that the minister did have discretion to waive those criteria in particular cases. It wasn't always waived, but there was at least an element of discretion conferred on the minister to deal with individual cases that maybe fell outside of the strict parameters of the scheme. Sorry, we don't know. So you'll see there that under these eligibility criteria of who could actually act as a quote sponsor, it didn't include all Afghans, for example, who are resident in Ireland, whether they held work permits, for example, or some other form of resident status. We don't know under this scheme whether it will be restricted in terms of who will be eligible to apply as an applicant. So this is just, I don't want to panic anyone who's saying, I don't hold protection status, I merely have discretionary leave to remain, for example, as the parent of an Irish citizen child. So I don't want to say to someone they won't be eligible, but these are the criteria from the previous two schemes that were operated. There were then criteria regarding the family members. They had to be a national of Afghanistan, for example, and they had to either live in that country or in a neighbouring third country, or be registered with UNHCR. So for example, it wasn't an opportunity to apply for reunification with a person who had already emigrated to Canada, for example. So it is focusing on responding to the needs of Afghans living in Afghanistan, for example, or where they've managed to flee already, if they're in a neighboring country like Iran or Pakistan or Tajikistan, that they would be eligible, or if they're living in a camp in another third country and are UNHCR registered. They also had to fall within a specific category of family relationship, which I'll come to in a moment, and there were vaccination requirements as well for family members. In order to qualify under a previous scheme, then, like, it was restricted to certain family members. So you'll see there I've set out, it was for the spouse or civil partner of an Afghan, where they hadn't maybe been able to apply for them to join previously under other schemes that are available. It was for an adult child, but provided where that adult child was unmarried and had no children. Minor children are usually always included in a scheme, and then it was extended in this case not just to include minor biological children, but also to minor children that the sponsor in Ireland had parental responsibility for. It was eligible for parents and grandparents, and then other vulnerable close family members for whom the proposer is the primary caregiver and they're not part of another family. So you'll see here that under previous schemes, it was not open to just apply for any family member, the cousin, the nephew, the aunt, even siblings, adult siblings, okay? So we don't know, again, many of the queries that we're getting at the moment are from people who go, I'd like to apply for my brother and my brother's wife and my brother's 3 children. Under the previous schemes, these were not necessarily family members for whom approval was envisaged as going to be granted. We don't know whether or not the current scheme that is proposed for Afghans will loosen the definition of family member that may be eligible to apply. Many people, whenever I raise this kind of family member definition, go, oh, but my friend, like, I know that they got their sister. If they did, it was under this final category, other vulnerable close family member. And it's not necessarily the case that it's always easy to kind of squeeze your own family situation within the same kind of considerations. There are always aspects of cases that people are not necessarily privy to, and why it is that the minister may have been willing to exercise discretion to admit somebody under a scheme when on the face of it they were excluded. And as I mentioned, the minister does have discretion to deal with cases on an individual case-by-case basis. So that was the previous scheme. These were the supporting documents. I won't go through them all, but just to note again, discretion did apply. There was no appeal process. That's very common in all immigration related applications, so it's not specific to IHAP, but it was possible sometimes to get an internal administrative review and get a decision overturned. But they were very strict about applications, like they turned them down if people didn't meet the criteria, if they couldn't provide the supporting documents and what have you. And again, because of the current context in Afghanistan and the difficulty of providing documents, and of course it's anticipated that this scheme will be issued sooner rather than later, we don't know what level of discretion or flexibility the minister may bring into play when the scheme is introduced, where there are genuine difficulties for all Afghans sending documents safely at this time. So that's the previous scheme. The other scheme that people inquire about, and many of you will be familiar with it, it's a separate option, okay? The IHAP scheme is where a person doesn't have eligibility to sponsor family members under the statutory family reunification scheme. When I'm referring to the statutory scheme, I'm specifically referring to the entitlement of people to bring family members to Ireland where they have been granted refugee or subsidiary protection status in Ireland. And so, for example, if somebody is relatively recently arrived and applied for protection under the international protection domestic refugee procedures and they are successful, they will have the entitlement to apply for certain family members under the statutory scheme. There will be no need for them to apply under IHAP and, so to speak, use up the places that are available under that scheme. That is a separate scheme intended to admit a wider cohort of family that do not qualify under this statutory scheme. So just to clarify, if you are a refugee or subsidiary protection status holder, you are eligible by Irish law under the International Protection Act to apply for certain family members. You can apply for your own spouse and your unmarried minor children if you were an adult at the time of applying for protection and they were your spouse at the time of applying for protection. If you were a minor at the time you applied for protection, then you may apply for your parents and your parents' minor unmarried children. It's not a standalone right to apply for siblings, unfortunately. So you can only apply for siblings as a refugee if you are also applying for your parents. And the application must be made within 12 months of the final grant of that decision. There's some details there on the slide about how to apply. I won't use the time now to go through that, but it's just to make it very clear that if you're eligible to apply under the Act, that's the best approach to take rather than trying to use IHAP thinking that'll be quicker or what have you. As I say, you don't want to use valuable places that could be given to other family members that don't qualify under the Act. The one thing I do want to stress is, though, that we see on our helpline, some people who do have refugee status are nonetheless putting in applications to the Family Reunification Unit under the statutory procedure for family members that do not qualify. So they're writing to say, I'd like to apply for my aunt, I'd like to apply for my uncle, I'd like to apply for my sibling, whoever it may be, but they simply don't qualify. But they're hoping that because of the crisis that the Minister for Justice will approve them by sending in the details. The Minister for Justice has no discretion whatsoever to deal with non-qualifying family members under the Act. And so I'm just underscoring here, it is absolutely not going to happen to apply for family members under the statutory procedure that do not qualify. You can only apply for your spouse, your unmarried children, or your parents if you are a minor at the time of applying under that scheme. So again, like for Mustafa, dealing with people contacting yourself and people getting their hopes elevated or thinking I'll just try it, it's almost like just a waste of their time. And when they don't get a response, they think, oh, maybe something's happening. That's not the correct avenue. It is always to look at which is the correct avenue for applying. And I'm just highlighting this as a possible option for those who are currently in the international protection process or recently granted positive decisions, or who are newly arrived under IRPP decisions who didn't have the opportunity to arrive with a spouse particularly, or minor children if they were coming as an adult, and that this might apply to them. The other option then for people, if they don't qualify under the statutory family reunification procedure, and because there is no IHAP application process at the moment, the current option that is on the table for people to apply for visas is under the discretionary family reunification procedure that is governed by what is called the INIS policy document for non-EU family members. That is always a de-reside visa application that I mentioned at the very beginning. Okay, so
sorry, can we just stop and then run the session again, because we'll be just in a minute and then
we'll get cut off. No problem. Yeah, I'll rejoin.
Yeah,
okay.
I'll just finish this and then everybody can click on the same link that I've shared. Yeah,
no problem.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone.
Information in here for participants to see what is generally required. Okay, and I want to underscore that the mere fact that a person can apply for a discretionary visa doesn't mean that it really stands prospect of success, particularly if those family members do not have passports or any of the normal supporting documentation that would be required. Nothing to do with Afghanistan or anything like that. The INIS policy document basically sets out that if you're an Irish citizen or a foreign national living in Ireland and you don't have a legal entitlement to be joined by a family member, you may apply for a visa which will be considered and granted on a discretionary basis, and that the minister will first of all give kind of preferred preference to what we call immediate family members. They are sometimes referred to as category A family members if you're reading the document. The document is quite lengthy, so unless you have a lot of time on your hands, it's not everybody's cup of tea to read that full document. But basically, to act as a sponsor, you need to meet certain criteria, but then to be an eligible family member, it's really quite restricted. So looking at eligible family members in the first place, it's really, as I say, immediate family members of the sponsor. So by immediate, I mean spouse and minor unmarried children. Thereafter, the minister will look at applications for parents of the sponsor. And then the final cohort that they will be looking at are other family. It's a very generic title. But really in category C, this other family, there are no specific guidelines set out in the INIS policy document to be met. But the reality is that family members are generally unlikely to qualify for family reunification unless they are exceptional circumstances. And people may say, well, the current situation in Afghanistan is exceptional, and that's not really what is envisaged under the policy document. Unfortunately, and rightly or wrongly, I make no comment on that. It's just that the reality is people who wish to apply for family members, this document is looking at, quote, normal times. And in normal times, you are more likely to have a prospect of success applying for a spouse or a minor child. But even then, in order to be successful, you'll see that there are typically criteria that must be fulfilled in order for the minister to exercise discretion, and typically they are financial criteria. Now, the minister has discretion to waive those financial criteria where there are compelling or humanitarian circumstances, but actually it's quite rare for that to be done, particularly where it comes to, quote, other family applications. So while I totally understand that people may want to apply for their sister, their sister's husband, their sister's children, the reality is I'm not sure that the visa office in the embassy will process a huge amount of applications, especially if financial criteria for sponsors are not met. And also if there is an absence of supporting documents. What I can say, like what I have seen in recent times, so the information that we can only really provide about the INS policy document is the general information, like what happens in normal times. It's not uncommon for a visa application. Those of you who have experience of dealing with this directly will be aware. It's not uncommon for a visa application, particularly one going through the specific embassies that Afghan family members go through, for visa applications to take between 12 and 24 months to be processed. On a positive note, what we have seen is accelerated visa processing in response to the current crisis. So that is positive. And there is an effort to engage with applicants or their representatives like me in a way that mightn't normally happen. And that is also a positive, I think. Instead of just refusing an application, documents not available, they are coming back, certainly in cases that I'm dealing with, to say, could you please provide additional information here, or could you please provide additional document there, rather than just refusing it. So there is sort of a good faith process of engagement, but it's still absolutely not the case that they are just approving everything and very quickly, because they do need to satisfy themselves regarding the identity of the family members that are being applied for, and it would appear that they are given priority in terms of processing to the immediate family member, so the spouse or minor children, and not necessarily able to provide the same level of access for other family members, whether that's parents or wider families such as siblings. Sorry, I've lost my ability. Can you see the screen there, everybody?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it just it went out of, no, I just go back to the right page there. So they were just some of the criteria regarding discretionary visa applications. As a matter of practical reality, again, just to underscore for everybody, you know, I am dealing with applications at the moment where people had passports for their spouse, for example, but that the passport was imminently about to expire, or where they have a passport for one family member but not the other. So, for example, the spouse may have the passport but the child doesn't. We haven't yet had an application get to a certain stage of processing where we fully know exactly what the embassy may be prepared to do where travel documents are not available. As I said, historically, when we deal with cases, or not even historically, at the moment when I deal with cases, but it's not to do with Afghanistan, arrangements can sometimes be put in place where if the family member can get into an embassy, they may be facilitated with a travel document, but you actually have to be able to physically present in person. And so there are huge limits at the moment to what the embassy can actually do. They may in principle be willing to approve something, but actually have no physical way of issuing it. And they've no physical way at present of actually assisting people to leave the country. So for those people who have been approved visas, the question is always, well, now what do we do? What arrangements can we make? And the reality is that the embassy can't even guarantee to get Irish citizens in Afghanistan out. And while they may be willing or prepared to provide assistance to Afghan nationals who they're not responsible for in terms of you know, international diplomatics, they physically can't actually assist them in a context where airport is closed or flights aren't leaving with any degree of frequency and what have you. So there are real limits post-approval to what actually can happen in the short term. And again, being a lawyer and being incredibly risk averse, I can't advise any client to have their family member cross a border irregularly where I have absolutely no idea what the authorities of that other country may do in terms of responding to a family member and whether they will respond favorably or otherwise. From a strict kind of immigration practice and procedure, in theory, one would like to apply for visas to lawfully enter into Tajikistan or Iran or Pakistan in order to be able to then board a flight in one of those countries to transit to Ireland. But the reality is that that's not easily done for anyone. People are still in the same circumstances of going, my family can't submit the passport if it's in Afghanistan to the Pakistan embassy, or it can't, easily deal with any of these things. And on top of that, then some people will be aware that even if you get the visas, there are still border crossing requirements, or they can't cross the border safely, or they need additional paperwork like a gate pass for Pakistan, for example. And there's very, very limited information in the public domain about how one goes about getting those documents, and whether or not one has to kind of engage in sort of a black market economy locally to deal with those matters. So there are huge limits to what either information providers in Ireland, such as myself, can provide, or what the state authorities through the embassies can do by way of practical assistance to assist people to leave. Normally, there are kind of international travel assistance programs operated by the UN, the Red Cross and IOM. And again, they're not able to operate those programs at the moment because of the current context. So, I'll move on from that. I just want to underscore that even where the minister may be prepared to issue a visa, there are real logistical difficulties for that actually resulting in the arrival of people into Ireland. I'm going to fly through this because it's actually a complex area of law, but I don't want to overlook the fact that some Afghan family members may have family members in Ireland who are citizens of other EU member states. If that is the case, then they don't have to rely on the discretionary visa process. There are legal entitlements under European Union law for family members of EU citizens to apply for visas. The criteria are that the EU citizen family member must be exercising free movement. Typically, that's when they're present here as a worker. I'm not going to dwell on it. We've only received a very small number of queries from kind of dual Afghan/EU national residents here in Ireland. But I want to leave it in the slides in case it's relevant to people after the event, and they can always follow up with specific queries that they may have. However, just to underscore that whole process again commences with the visa application being made by the visa required family member from Afghanistan and submitting it to the embassy. The only difference between the visa application that you would be applying for as a discretionary visa, if you're applying for a discretionary visa, you would apply for a D-class visa. Whereas if you're the family member of an EU citizen, not an Irish citizen, but if the Afghan is dual French, German, whatever, then the family member in Afghanistan applies for a C-class entry visa. It's not a discrepancy, but it's a difference in the overall general visa application. So back at the very beginning, when I just talked about general categories, it would be this C-class one, and it would be specifically in the drop-down menu, a visa application for a family member of an EU or EEA national that would be applied for. They are in theory eligible for an accelerated visa processing procedure, but again, it's completely predicated on the family members being able to submit relevant documents such as passports and evidence of the family relationship. So the reason they apply for a C-class entry visa as opposed to the D reside is that following arrival in Ireland, if the person does arrive in Ireland, they need to then apply through a very specific residence application process for a residence card if they're not just going to be staying on a temporary basis. So I won't go into that, but it's just to note that if you are dealing with specifically EU citizens who are also Afghan nationals or have Afghan family, that they wouldn't apply for discretionary visas for their family unless they don't actually qualify under the EU treaty rights application procedure. Again, related to EU treaty rights, I just want to touch on Brexit because some Afghans are obviously dual British nationals, and typically before Brexit, a person who was a dual Afghan/British national would have been eligible to apply for family members under the EU rules as well. That's changed since Brexit occurred, and there's now a new scheme for the family members of British citizens It's very similar to the discretionary arrangements for family members of Irish citizens. And so I've put some details in the slides here. The whole caveat being, of course, that there are criteria to be met in terms of financial thresholds to act as a sponsor, and then ministerial discretion to waive them. But the reality is, like, you have to bring yourself within the eligible category of family member. And really, when you're not talking about either the spouse or immediate partner and minor child, it's very, very difficult as a matter of reality to get visas approved, particularly if you're going into the parent category or horizontally into, or vertically rather, into the situation of adult siblings. They're just extremely difficult to get approved. So I'm going to stop talking there just for a moment and throw it over. But before I do, I just want to let attendants know that there are obviously a number of civil society organisations available to provide information and support, including ourselves, but also the Refugee Council, again, a national organisation, but based here in Dublin, Crosscare, based in Dublin, NASC, based in Cork, Durslim Me in Limerick. I suppose just to note that most of these organisations, they're charitable non-governmental organisations with small numbers of staff. And again, organisations are at capacity in terms of being able to provide direct support, and particularly in our case, or the Refugee Council, where we also have law centres, the other organisations don't. It's very, very difficult to be able to provide direct legal representation to every single applicant, but at least it's useful to be aware of the fact that there are organisations, and particularly these organisations will all be active when it comes to supporting people who may want to apply under IHAP when it's finally announced. And then I just note here as well the citizens information, particularly for anybody who's here today who has arrived recently under the IRPP scheme, that in every county in Ireland there's a citizens information office, at least one, sometimes two. They're very clued in to local sources of information regarding social welfare, housing matters, and what have you. And they're always a very useful starting point to get access to information. They have a very comprehensive website setting out the different kind of categories of social protection payments that people may need and how to apply for them and what have you. So I always say to people, do be aware of citizens information and the support that they can also provide to people. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Mustafa. I know that you sent me some questions prior to the event and we can go through them, but I'd like to throw it open to the floor first if people have questions.
Of course, thank you very much, Catherine, for great overview. Yeah, you've touched most of the question that I've shared with you, to be honest. So I would also like to ask the participants if you have any specific question that Catherine did not mention, please unmute your mic and then you can raise your question. And for those who have English problems, so we are here. We can be as a translator anyway. Yeah, Abdullah, you can unmute your mic. You can unmute your mic and.
Can you hear me?
I can. Yes. Hi, Abdullah.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and everything. Well, I have about two question or three question. The one
I just make a note of them here. If you can see me writing, it's just I'm making a note of them.
You turn on your camera, Catherine. We can't see you, just in case if you want. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I have a sister. She lives in Afghanistan. She was working for women's rights for maybe 10 years. And since last 7 years, she was working with Afghanistan Justice Department as a detective or prosecutor or investigator. And since this collapse suddenly happened, many of her colleagues, actually, they managed to go out of the country. And they lost their phones. There was no contact made to them. And
sorry, Abdullah, did you say they lost their homes or they lost their phones? I just
they lost their phone at the time, and their colleagues or bosses couldn't contact them. But they themselves, the colleagues and the bosses, they came out of the country. They are living in Norway and different European cities. And they left behind, and they were not in Kabul itself. They were in Paktia, which is in the south of the country. And by now, which is everything is closed, and they don't have no passports. The only thing they have is their national ID cards. And I asked them, the passport office is open now. How if you go there and apply there? Because he worked with the Justice Department in interrogating, the investigating, interviewing all those criminals. Probably they went to jail. Most of them now they released. The prisoners released. The prisoners are freed. And she says, I'm really scared if I go anywhere and I will be recognizable. And that's a big risk for them. Now they cannot even go there to register themselves for the passport. And they don't have no passport. And as you said, the passport is a must if they want to apply somewhere. Now we don't know how to deal with this situation.
Yeah, so you've touched on exactly like what is a huge logistical problem. If and when, whether you're intending, Abdullah, applying for a discretionary visa now or under IHAP when it's published, I mean, the starting point will be, can you satisfy us about your identity? So at least we know under the previous IHAP scheme that people could submit either a national passport or an identity card. Okay, so that the Department of Justice was satisfied that they were dealing with who they, were planning to deal with. So we don't know at the moment under discretionary visas if a person applies, as I said in my presentation, when it comes to the visa application form, you need to fill in the form, and in the form it says please put in your passport number, your issue date of expiry. You can put in fake details, so to speak, and then in a cover letter set out that this is a visa application for the sister of Abdullah, and that with reference to section whatever it is, those details are not correct, but it was for the purpose of being able to generate a visa application form. The facts are that this person is the sister, whatever, they have a national identity card, they do not hold a passport, and they have legitimate concerns about their ability to apply for a passport having regard to X, Y, and Z. And you literally set out what the specific facts are to enable the visa officer at a minimum to consider it. Now, what we don't know is how those applications will actually be dealt with, particularly in the context of a discretionary visa application process. As I mentioned, my experience at the moment is that those applications are not being refused per se, but they're not necessarily being processed, and that priority is being afforded to the family members that are immediate, like the spouse and the minor child of the Afghan or Irish citizen living here in Ireland. And what I am seeing there is where some family members do not have a passport, for example, or any evidence of an identity document, particularly if we're talking about an infant that has been born and had no possibility up until recently to apply for a passport, even, that they are still trying to satisfy themselves in the absence of civil registration documents that the child is likely to be the child. So, they are they're not refusing it, going, there's no documents here, but they are interrogating it a little bit. They're saying, look, can you provide us with maybe screenshots of text messages where your spouse communicated to you that they were pregnant and expecting a child? Can you provide us with documents that they sent you an update that the child has been born and here's a photo of us together, and whatever, like, so that they could draw an inference that yes, this really, and it's not an attempt on the part to bring, a niece or nephew that's not their child because they're just desperate to get some family out of Afghanistan. So there is this kind of process of scrutinizing applications, but none of them have yet got to the stage of a decision where I can actually say, This is actually, as a matter of practicality, what happened, where a passport was not available, that they have approved it through an ID card process or other supporting documents to build a body of evidence to suggest that they're satisfied with everything, but they are at least engaging, okay? The difficulty is that nothing to do with the Afghan crisis. Applying for siblings is all, and especially adult siblings, is always incredibly difficult. They're not typically granted for a start, and so they're just not kind of in a cohort where priority is going to be typically afforded. Obviously, I don't know in an individual case whether, for example, we'll forget about your personal sister without the passport. If somebody did have a passport for a family member and it was alleged that they were particularly at risk arising from a role that they'd held in employment and whatever, there's nothing again to stop the application being made and encouraging the department to process it as an IRPP visa as opposed to just a discretionary joint family visa, so that again, you know, you'll push whatever buttons you can to get something approved, but it's very different if somebody actually has a passport already. So all I can do is say, look, I'll remain in touch with Mustafa, and when we get more insight as time passes as to how maybe applications are dealt with where no documents are available, that we might be able to go, well, this is where the solution might lie. It was different under previous IHAP schemes, where, as I say, they either wanted the passport or they wanted the national ID document. And in those cases where they were willing to approve it because they were satisfied regarding the identity, there were then practical logistical things that people could do, like applying for an Irish travel document to facilitate entry. But in those kind of cases, previous IHAP schemes were open to not just Afghans, for example, they were open to nationalities from 10 different countries. And each case almost had to be looked at in its individual circumstances, because what might be possible in one case is not always possible in another for the very logistical things that I talked about. If an Irish travel document solution is on the table, it is predicated by the family member being able to actually enter an embassy, to physically have the biometrics dealt with and physical document issued to them. I mean, when they first mentioned the IHAP scheme coming for Afghans, they originally indicated it might be confined to Afghan family members who'd managed to leave Afghanistan. That's the physical difficulty for the Irish authorities at the moment. We see it in other regions of the world where they are willing to issue documents to people, but they say we can't helicopter into that region of West Darfur. If your family member can get out of there and can get to the embassy in Kenya or whatever, then we'll facilitate them, but we can't send a person in there at the moment to deal with that side of it. So it's a really, really difficult situation. And I don't have the answers for that where documents are not available, you know.
Thank you, Catherine.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained, I guess, is you start a process of communication by doing the visa application with a good cover letter to set out what the issues are and seeing what might happen. But I wouldn't want to give somebody elevated hope or false hope that it will easily be granted.
I hope you got your answer, Abdullah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's not a positive answer, unfortunately. But
Irshad Stanazai, you have raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question, or is it been you got your?
Yeah, I would like to ask a question.
Sure, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ms. Catherine, for giving us your precautious time and giving it briefly explanation. I would just like to ask a question regarding the IHAP scheme. And as I read about it, it's been written that 4 close family members. So what if family have 6 members or 7 members? Will it be any chances to get visas for all of them, or because they haven't announced the applications haven't been started yet, but I read it in the app, you know, in the website. It was written 4 close family members. And one thing more, if they're adult, all of them, and they're dependent on me, for example, or some of others, you know, they're not minors. So is there any chances for them?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's sort of a selection process where you will have to indicate your kind of top family members, okay? Under previous schemes, people had to apply for 2 family members, okay? And so like people then included additional family members, so there's nothing to stop you providing the details of other family members. And then this is where ministerial discretion kicks in, where you say, I would like to apply for my sister. They may fall within the other vulnerable category for whatever reason, because they may not be, your spouse or your minor child or whatever. So you have to fit them into the category that's most relevant to them. And then it's about setting out in the application process, like together with the sister, that it is also their 3 minor children, for example, or their 4 minor children, because your question specifically was, well, what if it's more than 4? The minister then has discretion to look at that and to decide, would they in principle accept that the person fell within the category of other vulnerable family member, and to decide then, will they exercise discretion to make it more than 4 in that individual case, because clearly they're going to be considering things like family unity. They're like, it would be first to say that we're prepared to admit mum and 3 of her children, but not mum and her 5 children where they're all minors. So like, and then that there would be an inevitable split of a family like that. So it's not a hard and fast rule about, so the minister is clearly indicating for people to manage their expectations, that this will not be a process where they're likely to have. Sorry? Sorry, Mustafa, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just, yeah, so you can proceed. I think somebody's mic was on, yeah.
Yeah, so no, I was just saying, I think the minister is signaling that people should manage their expectations. They're not likely to have applications for 7 siblings, their 7 siblings spouses and their 7 siblings dependents all approved. There may be an element of having to unfortunately choose out of all of the family members that you may wish to apply for, who on this occasion will you apply for, and to prioritize them. But that, like, if it was, for example, as I say, 1 sibling with 3 or 4 minor dependent children, you would put them all in, setting out why they're all included and asking that the minister, having regard to the specific facts of the case, that it would be approved. So under the previous case, for example, I am aware of an Afghan family who, although in theory you only have to apply or could only apply for 2, the applicant was successful in applying for her mother, her sibling, and her siblings' 3 minor children. But it's where there was very clear information communicated on the facts about the specific risk and obviously the importance of maintaining family unity in that particular thing. But it's not that you'll suddenly go, you'll get 16 family members all approved.
Thank you, Catherine. I hope Irshad got his answer. Ibrahim, can you please, I see you have, if you can ask your question. Ibrahim, you there?
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Catherine, for your interesting presentation. My name is Abdul Samad, so I have a specific question. My wife and my kids are in Kabul, so once I put the information in the questionnaire, so after a green light from the government of Ireland, so there will be needed another form sort of questionnaire or something for the family reunification process, or this will be helpful to the government, like the questionnaire?
Yeah, well, it's just like, which I'm just not clear on your question. Like, under what scheme have you currently applied, or are you planning to apply under the IHAP? Sorry, I'm just not clear on that.
I'm a new year, so I'm an asylum seeker. So I just evacuated the country on 20th of July this coming year. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm in the camp right now.
Okay.
So I just passed my initial interview with the IPO office. They gave me the questionnaire. So once I filled out the questionnaire, because of my family, like my kids and my wife, so that will be enough for them, or after my
Yeah, no, so I'll clarify that for you. Sorry, this is helpful because I just wasn't clear on what the background was. So if you're currently an asylum seeker, then you would have to wait for that process to be concluded and for you to be granted refugee status. Now, I'm not going to make any commitment to you about how long that process will take, other than the generic information made available in the public that the Department of Justice was going to prioritise outstanding Afghan applications for international protection and to try and bring them to a conclusion as soon as possible. So fingers crossed for you. But if and when your application is finalised and you get a positive grant of protection status, so you'll either be granted refugee status or subsidiary protection if your application is approved. If you get that positive approval, then you would be eligible to apply under the statutory scheme, okay? You would not be applying under IHAP or under discretionary visas. You would apply specifically under this scheme. So your wife won't be, well, I would be very surprised to hear that when they approved your application, if they approve it, that they then immediately proceeded to approve your wife, because that's typically not what happens. You then would have to apply under the International Protection Act. And I've set out details here at the bottom of that slide. I hope you can see it here on the screen. Oops, I've just missed it there. You would apply under the statutory scheme here, where you send a letter after your approval to the Family Reunification Unit of the Department of Justice. It's initially a letter saying, I'm Afghan, I have refugee status, I want to apply for my wife and my 3 children, or whatever the case is, and their dates of birth are X and they're currently living in Y. And that's all you use to trigger the application. The department receives it. They do a superficial look at it, first of all, to go, has the person actually applied for people who are eligible, bearing in mind that you can only apply for certain family members. If you put into that application that you wanted to apply for mum and dad and your adult sibling and your second cousin, they won't give you the questionnaire for all of those families. So you can only apply under this statutory scheme for eligible family members. And so you would then be issued a questionnaire to complete for those specific family members. Usually with that questionnaire, you're then asked to return certain documents. It's usually at a minimum 2 color photographs for each family member, passports or other identity document, and then civil registration documents such as tezkira or birth certs or whatever. Every case is different depending on the country, what civil registration documents they have. And then you send that all back, and then there's an ongoing process, okay? Now, normally that process, forget about now, it can be a slow process, and where documents are not available, it can also be slower again. And particularly if there are children, they frequently want to do DNA testing. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of your case and how complicated it might be right now, but you would use this procedure and not the IHAP one. You would use IHAP if you are approved and you also want to apply for additional family members who don't qualify under the statutory family reunification procedure. You could apply for your parents, for example, under IHAP, or if there was another family member who's dependent on you, you would put it in under IHAP. It is pointless applying under this statutory procedure for family members that don't apply. And I can say that kind of confidently because I deal with a lot of these applications for very many years, so I'm aware of what the limits are and the parameters of the application procedure. It's not that I'm just saying, oh, it's a waste of your time. Like, a lot of these issues have been litigated, and so it's a very, very clear procedure. Okay.
Catherine, we have 1 more minute left, so do you want me to start another session for 40 minutes? I was expecting to be.
Sure, if you want to. Yeah, no problem. I'll join again.
I think we have a couple of questions anyway. I'll just stop this and then start again so everybody can click on the same link. Yeah.
To respond like internationally as part of the community to refugees, and this is nothing to do with Afghanistan. So like I suppose to first of all clarify to anyone who may have heard that figure of 4,000, that is not a commitment made to Afghans. It's a commitment made by the Irish government that under the IRPP over a number of years that they would commit to admitting 4,000. And if you look at the Department of Justice website, they publish clear information about the figures issued to date and to whom they have been issued. And they have varying ongoing commitments through resettlement programs and the UN, specifically in Jordan and Lebanon, for people living in camps there, as opposed to Lebanese and Jordan nationals. And they have an ongoing program to bring in other nationalities as well. So it's kind of like a bit from here and a bit from there and a bit from, and they may of course like not stick to 4,000 forever. Like that was an initial commitment in the coming years that they would do that, as opposed to like maybe in the next 10 years increasing that again. I mean, many countries recognize that our equivalent of the IRPP is a very useful mechanism for the state bringing to Ireland people who are recognized to be refugees and to fulfilling commitments towards refugees, rather than having a domestic procedure for newly spontaneously arrived individuals. So, I mean, I wouldn't cling to that 4,000 figure at all. It's comprised of people under EU relocation. When people were brought from the Greek islands, nobody ever made it from Italy for different reasons. There was a program specifically for unaccompanied children living in Calais when they wound up the camps in the jungle officially. There's still obviously unofficial camps there and whatever. So I would ignore the 4,000 figure. It's irrelevant. The state can decide whenever it wants to admit whomever it wants. And clearly it has done so in the current context with the initial commitment to issue 195 visas under IRPP. That's clearly gone up, but it doesn't mean that anyone can expect that suddenly they'll issue thousands. And then like clearly under IHAP, which is part of IRPP, they said they will admit 500 under this. That could end up being 650. It's a commitment to deal with at least 500. And they're obviously then trying to manage expectations, saying each applicant may be able to prioritize 4. Doesn't mean to say no applicant will only get 4. Some may only want to apply for 1 person. Some may want to apply for 7, and they look at all of the applications and maybe see what is possible.
Thanks. And can I just ask as a follow-on, do you have any more information around the community sponsorship program, or how that will be introduced, or if there will be any more information coming on that anytime soon?
No, I don't, and my office is not involved in community sponsorship work, so I would direct any queries that you have regarding that to those organisations that are involved in it, which is the Refugee Council or NASC, together with Amnesty and whatever. It's a different entry route whereby people can obviously sponsor people to come here, but it's usually not where there's a direct family relationship already established. So, but yeah, I would just direct any queries that you may have regarding that. Yeah.
Can I also ask one more really quick question? Sorry. So we've just been, we've basically been working with universities as well to explore the possibility of student and, professorships and fellowships to see, what support they can provide. And, with the possibility of the student visa route being relatively possibly an easier application process. Now, I don't know if you would have any information or advice on that in terms of, basically what we're trying to do is, if at all possible, fast track some people through who could be, who could have a student, who could get a studentship or a fellowship or a place at a university. And, what would be then the option if they were brought through the universities in transitioning towards maybe refugee or immigrant, status, so that they could essentially stay. I don't know if you have any information on that.
Yeah, well, there's already like various academics, particularly I'm aware of some in Trinity who are involved in kind of scholars at risk programs. I mean, that was obviously in the media regarding the UK response as well, where there was an academic response to identifying scholars at risk and bringing them in. There's no particular structure to that, and some people are pushing at the door of frontline and some people are going down the road of student visas. I mean, it's always open to navigating that. Parking what might be possible, because like we're not going to come to any resolution on that right now. the reality is, if you apply for a student visa and it is granted, I mean, there's nothing to stop a person instantly on arrival then applying for international protection. So it's not, you know, and if they do that, happy days. But like, you know, it's not something that I would really comment on now about what are their routes, because like the Irish system for international students is based on what is a normal scenario and not responding to an international crisis. So I don't want to put into a forum like this, like where it gets disseminated perhaps and people get completely the wrong end of the stick about, oh, if I do this, then I would just do that. Like I just don't think I could really meaningfully comment on that. Like, you're looking at a longer term advocacy strategy rather than what should one individual specifically do.
We have someone from the IPU customer service. Sorry, maybe he can comment on this. I don't know. Yeah, from the IPU customer service from the Department of Justice. I don't know if he can.
Good afternoon. I'm afraid I can't. I'm using the IPO customer services Zoom account, but I'm not in a position to comment on that. So apologies.
All right, thanks. Aoife, do you have any further question, or should I ask?
Yeah, that's okay. I think that's enough for me. Thanks, Mr. Van. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks. Yeah, Atikola Mangal from Waterford. If you can ask your question, please. You raise your hand. Atikola, if you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine, for sharing this information about the immigrants on schemes, all that. And thank you very much to your person to make opportunity to share questions and information. So there was many questions, but I got for all of them the answers. But only one question I want to ask them, and that is when the country took over by the Taliban. So on the second day, I sent application. I sent application to the many consul, immigrant consuls, and about my brother. But I didn't get any reply from them. And you know, there was a people. I know the person working with the consul is from Afghanistan, and also he applied for his brothers, but they get the visa for their brothers because their brothers' families. But also ask him as well, you know, to how to do the application. But I didn't get the reply from him. But still, I didn't get any reply from any consuls. So can you tell me information about that, like how I can apply for my brothers who works with the foreign troops and they supplies food and all the things to them from capital to provinces and from province to capitals, and they was working there. So now they are starting.
Atikola, I'll just cut across you there, okay? Because I'm not sure that you need to share kind of specific details about your family members in a public forum, okay? First of all, I'm not sure that I fully understand about where you say you sent an application to a council. I'm not sure who you sent an application to. And also, like when you say other people's applications were approved because they were with the council, like I don't know what you mean, okay? So I'll clarify for you that, for example, when people contact the Immigrant Council of Ireland, for example, they may submit an application through a form of communication to us that gets missed because it's not the way in which service users communicate with our office. So for example, some people send emails to an email address that is not actually like an out of office reply will go, this address is not being monitored. We don't have a capacity to deal with it or what have you. So specifically in response to these cases, like I had been in contact with Mustafa when initially some queries came in from the Afghan Council, for example, and to put a bit of structure on that, like how information could be received. So if you have details and separately outside of this forum today, want to contact Mustafa, Mustafa can link you in with me because he knows how it's helpful for us in our office to receive that. That's very separate to how my office also receives referrals in other cases, or how, for example, the Irish Refugee Council may accept referrals through their own services. So, for example, like if you hear that a friend of yours was assisted by a council and then their family members got visas, you can't automatically assume that that council or whoever it is going to be able to get visas for your family members, unfortunately. Each case has to be assessed on its own particular facts and then fitted within the appropriate scheme that might be available to that person. So some of my clients recently have had successful visas processed, but it's where they have very clear entitlements to a visa to be issued, for example, under the statutory family reunification procedure, because they are eligible to apply under that procedure, and perhaps their process was in train for quite a long time prior to the immediate events in the middle of August happening. So I would just not like you to have a false expectation that if, for example, you link in with Mustafa and he sends me some details regarding your family, that our office or any other office would be easily able to achieve a solution for you. Okay, so what really is important is that we receive clear information about who the person in Ireland living is, what their resident status is. Do they have refugee status? When was it granted? Are they an Irish citizen? Are they in employment? Are they an EU citizen? And what their facts are, so that we can then assess in relation to the information that I shared with you in the presentation, are they, likely to qualify for priority under a discretionary visa application process now because it's an immediate spouse? Is it perhaps better for them to wait for the IHAP scheme, because although they could in theory apply for a discretionary visa for their uncle, in reality it's probably not going to be granted, or quickly anyway. Or do they qualify under EU treaty rights or under whatever? So as I said, some people have been submitting applications to the Family Reunification Unit under the statutory scheme that is never going to look at that application because the family member is simply not eligible. I don't know whether or not our colleague here from the International Protection Office can also maybe confirm, maybe they're getting emails, but they don't deal with family reunification. So it's not like they will be able to, if they respond, it might be to say you need to direct your query to the Department of Justice, but they won't have capacity to assess what might be the best route for that person, because it's not the function of the IPO to give family reunification guidance to an individual about how to apply, unfortunately. So I don't want to put you on the spot from the IPO office, but it is very clear that you need to identify what is the correct avenue and make sure that your case is dealt with appropriately.
Thanks, Catherine. I will call Atikullah later on and then send you an email.
Perfect.
With his contact details. I hope you got your answer, Atikullah, and yeah, we will take care of that. Najibullah, look, if you can please ask your question, Najibullah.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for your help and support and advices. It's first time I'm using Zoom. If you can tell me that you can hear me.
I can, yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had a question, please. I'm a British citizen. I've been living in Ireland for the past 5 years, and my wife has a son for under EU treaty right. Is it possible for me or for her to invite a family member? If yes, under what scheme we can apply, please?
Yeah, so your situation, I'm not going to say whether or not you'd be successful or not, but if you went back through the presentation after here, you'll see that in the section that I set out about family members of EU citizens, I had a couple of slides relating to post-Brexit and family members of British citizens. So I don't know if you can see the slide there.
Yeah, if you can share your screen, Catherine. Yeah.
So it's there at slide 23 to do with family members of British citizens. And then it's likely to be like a pre-clearance application for certain family members. The criteria are published in the scheme since, I mean, previously, when Britain was part of the European Union, those applications were assessed in accordance with the Citizenship Directive, and there were no financial criteria to be met for certain family members, but other family members need to establish dependence. And like, it's also a question of assessing whether or not the British family member or other person is qualified to act as a sponsor. So like you can see there just from the slide, it's obviously very superficial information, but there are general financial criteria to be met and what have you. And then it relates to like what category of family member a person wishes to apply for. So it's never just a question of, yes, you can apply and this is the procedure. There is guidance published for the specific categories of family members that are considered to be eligible to apply if they are the family member of a British citizen. It's their spouse, their civil partner, or their unmarried intimate partner, as well as dependent children of the sponsor, etc., etc. Thereafter, if you can't fit within a scheme, it is still always possible to apply for a discretionary visa, but it's highly, highly discretionary, and you need to set out like what the facts are, all of the supporting documents, evidence the family relationship. If it's alleged that they are dependent, you know, establish the nature of that dependence, and it still doesn't mean that the visa will be granted. So like, I would always encourage a person, like, pick up the phone to our helpline. I appreciate it can be difficult to get through, but at least it can be teased out with a caller in more time than is available today, what might be the appropriate scheme for them. And obviously, in the context of IHAP not yet being fully published and the criteria to be known, like I don't know at this point in time whether or not IHAP will be open to family members of British citizens, because under previous schemes, the eligibility criteria were that the applicant had to have international protection status holder or Irish citizenship. And so it was not for all people who had family members who met the criteria. So, you know, I would just encourage you to pick up the phone and go, this is the specific situation I'm in. These are the particular family members that I'd like to apply for. And depending on those family members, it might be different schemes that you might need to look at for each specific family member. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Does anybody else have a question? Can you please raise your hand or unmute your mic and ask the question?
Sorry, Mustafa, it's me, Atikullah, again.
Atikullah, yeah.
Sorry, if you don't mind. I was asking two more questions, which is about scholarship, about students and work permit. And so, because I know many people, they send me texts from the country, like if there's any possibility for them, or what's the requirement here of students or work permit. So regarding about this, if she has something, you know, she can share with us. So I will write down there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer the generics of that, Atikullah. Like, we have different entry routes to Ireland in theory for different classes of family members or of foreign nationals. So in theory, it's possible for people to apply for student visas. In theory, it's possible to apply for employment permits, for example. But international study permits, like, usually that's applied for after a person has already applied to a third level institution and been given a place and can demonstrate that they'll pay the fees and that they've private health insurance, etc., etc., etc. And once all of that has happened, then they apply for the visa, and the visa or the embassy looks at it and satisfies themselves that it's, you know, a genuine enrollment, that the person is who they say they are, that they can provide the passport and what have you. So, like, it's very much an individual application rather than something that you can say the doors are open to international students. I mean, they've always been open, and if somebody wants to make an application, it's just a question of whether or not they can apply. You don't, in theory, just apply for a student visa and after arrival in Ireland, then find the academic institution that's willing to take you. So it's not, it's just well, in theory, student visas are possible, but whether in reality it will meet the need of a specific individual is another matter. Like for third level courses, for example, there can be requirements that the person fulfill language criteria to be able to participate in the course. They need to have evidence of a certain level of financial support and whatever. So while some people might meet the criteria, not everybody will. When it comes to employment schemes, they're again very individually led, and less so by the prospective employee, but by the employer. So in theory, again, it's possible for people to come to Ireland for employment purposes, but it's usually where employers have identified that they have vacancies, and through an advertised recruitment process, they have settled on, Mustafa Tariq as being the candidate that they feel best meets their vacancy and requirements, and that they meet a whole load of other criteria that are published by the Department of Enterprise before employment permits will be issued to an individual. So it's not really kind of very helpful to be able to say employment permits are a possible entry route in response to the Afghan crisis, because we don't have schemes here that exist in other countries, for example, where you can apply for permanent residence from outside of the state by fulfilling points requirements and showing, I have a doctor qualification and I have this, and can I please come? It's done the other way around. An employer says, I have a vacancy, and if the person has applied for it and they've been successful in the recruitment process, then an employment permit application is made on their behalf and what have you. So again, it might be an entry route for some people, but it's not likely to be a generic response to ensuring that people can come to Ireland in a particular migration route, and certainly in large numbers.
Thanks, Catherine. I don't see any raised hands. So there's one question. I've got an email, Catherine. I don't know if you've touched this. I know you said that whoever came to Ireland on the IRPP scheme just last 2 months, there's a question that can they apply for IHAP or Family Reunification? I know you said that they have similar rights as the Irish citizens or the subsidiary protection. Can they apply straight away for the IHAP? But
they don't apply for IHAP because IHAP is not open. Okay, so nobody can.
When it opens, like or Family Reunification.
Yeah, they're probably, well, depending, again, it's always which category of family member do they wish to apply for. So, for example, if somebody recently arrived under IRPP, and assuming that they have completed the process and they've been issued their final paperwork and have their residence card and whatever, then in theory, they're eligible to apply. And the question is, who do they wish to apply for? If they had come here as an adult male, for example, and they have a spouse and child who hadn't been able to join them at that time for whatever reason, then they may be able to apply under the statutory scheme, because programme refugees are entitled to apply for family reunification for certain family members, and provided it's within 12 months of the grant of status. If it is that they wanted to apply for their parent, for example, then they cannot apply for their parent yet, because they cannot go under the statutory scheme, because it's not possible to apply for a parent under the statutory scheme. They could, in theory, apply for a discretionary visa, but the question is whether or not, they have the appropriate supporting documents to do that, and whether or not it would be given any kind of priority treatment is uncertain. So they may decide that they want to wait for the IHAP scheme, having regard to, what they understand might be the documentary requirements that go with that, or the eligibility scheme criteria from, whatever is available from previous schemes.
And should they wait 3 years for the naturalization or 5 years? This question also.
I'd have to double check that, but actually I think it's 3 years, because they have the same rights and entitlements as refugees, which is 3 years, but I would double check that. Subsidiary protection is different.
I also got this one. What is the process of relocating new Afghans? They might be tired, safe in Muzni.
What is the process of what, sorry?
Relocating, currently most of them are living in Muzni. but
yes.
Have you any information on this regard? Like, what's the process of relocating them? Like,
no, well, I mean, like relocation is always kind of a mixture of like what is the individual's personal circumstances and then what is actually available to them. So there's no obligation on any person to remain within a residential centre, including whether or not they're an asylum seeker in the domestic international protection system or whether or not they now have refugee status. So they are obviously at liberty to live anywhere in the community that they wish to, provided they're able to either access private rental accommodation, which is difficult in some cases, or, depending on whether or not they have already been approved for certain social assistance payments like housing payments, or like if they've entered employment and what have you. So, it again is it's a difference between the theoretical and the actual practical logistics of relocating. So nobody is saying that it's a mandatory requirement for them to remain within Mosney or any other reception centre, but like it's a question of whether or not they are actually able to find alternative suitable accommodation for them and their family. My office, unfortunately, doesn't have a wider integration support officer dealing specifically with housing. They may want to contact, depending on where they are living, a support community organisation that may be able to assist. At a national level, it's the Irish Refugee Council that do have a housing officer, but like it's not necessarily the case that that housing officer will be able to assist them to find accommodation in all cases, but they may be able to work with them to explain what the process is of applying for local authority housing, going on the list, securing housing assistance payment, explaining the intricacies, because we have a very complicated local authority system here in Ireland, as you're probably aware, that if you are living in one area and get approved for local authority housing there, you will be on a waiting list because there's unlikely to be accommodation immediately available. But if you move local authority area, then you need to start the process from scratch. So it's a complicated area. So I would encourage somebody in that situation to link in with their local citizens information centre, for example, for some initial, find out whether or not there is any local community housing group that tries to assist with that, or again, to link in with the Irish Refugee Council, for example, to see if they can provide them with either information or actual support.
Yeah, actually, we have Hannah from the Irish Refugee Council in
great.
Here.
I didn't see her there, but I do. I see Hannah, but I wasn't
myself
aware of Hannah. Yeah.
The education of this newly arrived Afghans. There's a question that some of them have bachelor's or master's degrees. Can they proceed here straight away, or I could not find any information?
That again is a very difficult question, Mustafa, because it can depend on the specific qualification. So here we have what's called the National Qualifications NQI standard or whatever. Some are recognized, some are not. Some need to go through a very specific recognition process, so it can depend on the nature of the qualification and what have you. So I think it's really important that a person not just get a yes or no answer to that and find out what might be specifically required in their own individual context. So obviously it depends, here for different professions, for example, doctors, architects, lawyers, there are specific recognition procedures that people need to go through. So I would suggest that in that context, somebody get in contact, or at least I can send you after this actually the link to the qualification framework information and the office that deals with that. It's a complicated process. Okay.
Thank you. Najibullah, do you have a question? Najibullah Karlok. So we have 8 minutes. If you have any question, we'll wrap up in 8 minutes time, just to let everyone know.
Okay, thank you very much. Just now I remember one more question, please. As I said, my wife has a stamp for under EU treaty, right, which is for 5 years. When can she apply for an Irish citizenship? Is it at the end of the 5 years court, or it's 5 years from the day she entered into the island? And also for me and for my children, we have British passport. When can we apply for an Irish passport? And the length of the time, please.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll deal with general requirements for citizenship. And again, if it's something that's of interest to your members, I'm happy, Mustafa, to do a separate seminar on citizenship because there's a whole load of different procedures depending on whether or not children were born in Ireland or born overseas or whatever. So I don't want to interrogate you in public, Najibullah, but like facts matter when it comes to possible citizenship routes for people. At a very basic level, for a foreign national who's residing in Ireland, if they're not a refugee or stateless person, they're typically eligible to apply after what is called 5 years reckonable residence. And reckonable residence sort of needs to be looked at in an individual case. So it's not 5 years from the date of entry to Ireland. Your wife may have arrived in Ireland, for example, on a C-class visit visa, and she wouldn't, quote, have reckonable residence at that stage. So it would be 5 years after she had been granted residence. But something that I always say to a person here is that, first of all, if there's no entitlement to be granted citizenship first and foremost, so whatever residence status a person holds, they need to make sure that they deal in a timely way to renew that residence status and or to apply for a change of status, and to make sure that they hold a relevant residence permit throughout their residence in Ireland, but also throughout the citizenship and naturalization procedure. The first thing I'd say to you to pay attention to in the context of your wife is to make sure that she first of all applies for the card replacement scheme, which is a requirement imposed on British citizens who hold stamp for EU FAMs. Since Brexit came into effect, you're supposed to apply for a card replacement within the next 12 months, like since the 1st of January. Again, I don't want to go into the specifics of your wife's case because it's not appropriate in a forum like that. So I would always say to a person, before you apply for citizenship, you make sure you attend to all of the matters that you need to deal with before you become eligible. And then particularly if a person is the family member of an EU or a post-EU, now Brexit, British family member, that they apply on time to renew that residence status. So many people contact our helpline and say, oh, I applied through the portal to renew my card or at my local immigration office, and they missed the trick that they actually need to apply to the EU Treaty Rights Division 6 months before the expiry of the current family member's card to renew and or be granted permanent residence, and to keep up on top of all of that, because if there are periods where cards expire, that is not counted as, quote, reckonable residence towards the 5 years that is needed for citizenship. And like, it's not just as straightforward an analysis as 5 years residence prior to applying. There's also continuous residence requirements in the last 12 months. So if gaps arise then either by virtue of absence from the state or because you've allowed a card to lapse unwittingly because you weren't familiar with the procedures, then that can be problematic and you need to wait another 12 months before you're able to apply. So there's a lot, I think, that people need to pay attention to when it comes to hopeful plans to apply for citizenship. So I would encourage you pick up the helpline number to either our office or the Refugee Council or NASC or whoever you're able to get in touch with to actually tease out when your wife might be able to apply and what she might need to pay attention to before she applies. And then similarly for your children, there are different procedures about when you would be able to apply for them. If they haven't yet joined you in the state, you can't apply for citizenship for them unless very specific circumstances apply because you held citizenship yourself at the time of their birth or other matters. Usually access to citizenship is predicated upon birth within the territory, and then it depends on whether or not you get it at birth or when you might be able to apply in the future. If they are children that were born outside of the state and join you in Ireland, then the typical arrangement is that a parent must naturalise first before they will accept an application for naturalisation on behalf of the child. If they were born in Ireland, then an application can be made when the child's parent has 5 years residence and without a requirement that a parent naturalise. So again, like there are all of these different multiple kind of options and things to look at in individual cases, and different things might apply to different children within the same family unit. So you need to get specific advice and not just rely on generic information about everyone being treated in the same way.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very helpful. My children, 2 of them were born in the UK. they have a British passport, and one of them was born here a few months ago.
So the rules, I'm just conscious of giving other people time for questions, Najibullah, but like in that context, the rules are going to be different for your children. So I think I would just say, please pick up the phone to the helpline and tease out with one of our information officers what is the route for each child. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No problem.
Atikullah, I'm going to connect you with Katrin so you can ask her questions when you're speaking to her. So I think, you have only 2 minutes left, and thank you so much, Katrin, for your time.
Very welcome.
Outstanding job you did, and information that everybody was, to be honest, looking for it. Do not forget, everyone, we will have another session. I was talking to Katrin sometime in November, just before the IHAP. And if you have any questions, we will be working on that, and then you can send in. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katrin, again. Really helpful. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mustafa, for inviting me. And also, I suppose, just to say that, obviously, I wish there was more that we could do to assist. It's a very difficult time for Afghans and their family members, and we're really acutely conscious of that. And so sometimes, when I'm dealing directly with the case, I hope people understand that, I'm not trying to push them away. For example, when I say there's nothing that can be done at this point in time, it's just that there are very real practical limits. And we ourselves are trying to prioritize the cases where we feel that we can actually do something to get something dealt with on a priority basis. So I suppose just to say thanks for the opportunity to let you know that we are all working very closely with our colleagues in the Refugee Council and NASC and other organisations who are equally concerned. I wouldn't like to give the impression that it's just the Immigrant Council of Ireland who is available to provide support here. It's not. I just was available myself today to do this. And so please do keep in touch. And as I say, it's most helpful for us in terms of people who want to make an approach for assistance, that perhaps come through Mustafa. I don't want to burden Mustafa, but if it comes centrally through the Afghan Council so that we have access to the information, we're at our limits in terms of capacity, that's nothing to do with the Afghan crisis. Unfortunately, we try and respond to as many queries as we can through our helpline. Many people find it difficult to get through, but we're under-resourced at the moment. So we have to just temporarily stop people